Today we will be continuing where we left off. The last time we talked about cells and how to observe them using microscopy, light microscope basically, the generalized look of animal and plant cells, the structures you would expect to find in them, uh, the features that are common between both animal and plant cells, which are the cell membrane, the cytoplasm, and the nucleus. For the plant cell, common structures are the cell wall, a large vacuole, and chloroplasts. And then some structures that you would observe under an electron microscope are mitochondria and ribosomes. And both of these you will be able to find in animal and plant cells. Then we talked about bacterial cells and some of their common structures. They have cell walls, granules of food reserves, ribosomes that are smaller than the ones found in animal and plant cells. They have circular DNA without a nucleus. And then they've got small circular pieces of DNA. Let me rewrite that. So there are small circular pieces of DNA called plasmids. And they help to survive and reproduce, I believe, right? And I'm struggling with what I've written myself. And there was a problem with the touch sensors on the screen. That's why it wasn't coming out right. So this time I've got a different set of hardware. So they help in their survival and reproduction. Do you have any questions from the material we covered last time and the one we just reviewed?
No.
Okay. So carrying on, today we will talk about tissues, organs, and organ systems, and we'll be starting from that topic and then moving on. Organ systems. So first up are tissues, and obviously we're not talking about the ones you use to, wipe your nose. So tissues are a group of cells, right? A tissue, in biological terms, is a group of cells with similar structures working together to form a shared function. Now, about similar structures, the individual cells. So it's a group of cells, right? So the individual cells of tissues right also have the same function. So what does that mean? That means, right, for example, if the function of a cell is to secrete enzymes, right? And so a group of them comes together to form a tissue, which will be a gland. which secretes enzymes. Secretes the same enzyme, but obviously in much larger quantities. We've got other examples of tissues as well. Uh, for example, right, we've got bone, nerves, muscle cell, muscle tissue, right? So in animals, bones, nerves, muscles, right? We talked about the gland. We've got epithelial cells. Sorry, we've got epithelial cells and tubes. So all of these are tissues. These are examples of tissues of animals. And then you've got, you know, for plants, you've got the xylem vessel, for example. Now, right, you may be familiar with some of these, may not be with others, and right, that's fine. Obviously, this is an introductory chapter, so they'll be mentioning things that will just give you a hint and a taste of what's to come. You can, use the analogy, the one that we come across in math, that if one worker, right, paints a house in, let's say, right, 20 days, how many days will it take? 5 workers. And you can do the simple math and you would say, oh, well, it would take 4 days. Right? Now, it's not quite exactly the same thing, but you have few cells and then you've got a group of cells forming a tissue. Right? So obviously the effectiveness and the output of a tissue will obviously, right? So effectiveness and output of tissue is obviously far greater than an individual cell. Clear?
Yeah.
Now, the book mentions certain tissues. They talk about the epithelial tissue. So I'll just briefly mention them over here. The epithelial tissue. And this, right, forms a layer lining, it forms the lining of different cavities. Of different structures or cavities in the body. For example, the mouth or the esophagus, which is your food pipe, right, or food canal, and it also protects the organs from physical or chemical damage. Then you have, let me write that down. And they mention, right, cells forming tubules to carry, right, carrying liquids from one part of an organ to another. For example, the kidney tubules. You have obviously the muscle tissue, and these are present in blood vessels. So muscle tissues, blood vessels, nerve fibers, and connective tissues. So when you talk about muscles, you will find blood vessels, nerve fibers, and connective tissues with the muscles. What do muscles do? They contract. Why do you need blood vessels to supply the muscles with nutrients? Why do you need nerve fibers to send signals to inform the brain for muscle contraction? Connective tissues to hold them together, right? They contract, and so, for example, in the stomach, right, when food's being digested, the contractions of the stomach help mix the food together with the enzymes and acid and digest it properly. Then, as you mentioned, you've got glands, right? And they make and release chemicals, right? They could be enzymes or hormones, right? So they could be secreted directly into the blood. They could be secreted into a cavity, like again, or maybe for example, something else like the glands secreting. You got salivary glands, so they've got enzymes in the mouth. You've got stomach acid, so hydrochloric acid being released from the stomach. Right, so that is neither an enzyme nor a hormone. Yeah, so those are some examples of tissues. Any questions?
No.
Okay. Then we come to organs. And an organ is a structure made up of a group of tissues. So tissues are groups of cells, and organs are made up of group of, right, different tissues working together to perform a special function. Right? And so again, an example would be the stomach. It's a good example, right? You've got glands, you've got epithelial cells, you've got muscle cells. So you've got all of these tissues all present in the organ that is called the stomach, right? And you've also got a supply of blood vessels. So you've got vasculature, as it's called, vasculature, right? Other examples, and oh yeah, obviously, nerves. Other examples may be lungs, heart, kidney. I mean, you name it. Any organ of the body, the spleen, the liver, the kidneys, right? The
Yeah.
brain, obviously. The brain
Like
is,
it also includes the organs of the plant as well.
yes. So plants also have certain, right, certain structures that classify as organs.
Yeah.
So in plants, right, an organ would be the root or the stem or the leaf.
Sure.
So leaves are organs, the root are an organ, the stem is an organ. And right, so what are the tissues involved? For example, we did mention the xylem, but right, so a bit more, you've got the xylem, the phloem, and then you've got the epidermal cells, so the epidermis. Then you have the spongy, right, the palisade, in fact, first, the palisade mesophyll, and then the spongy mesophyll. Right, so all of these are tissues, and
Yeah.
you'll find these tissues, right, in these guys. Some have all of them, some have some of them. So the leaves have the xylem and the phloem and the epidermis and the palisade mesophyll and the spongy mesophyll, right? The roots have the xylem and phloem, so do the stem, right? Roots have some other types of tissues, stem have also some other types of tissues that we're not listed over here. So yeah, anything else?
No.
And then finally we come to organ systems. So an organ system is a group of organs with related functions working together to perform a body function. No, not body, body function. Right, so examples of organ systems are the nervous system, right, which includes the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves primarily. And these nerves are all over the body, right? So they're going to muscles, organs, right, everywhere. Then you've got the digestive system, and you've got plenty of organs over here, right? You've got the stomach, you have the liver, you've got the intestines, both large and small, right? You have uh,
Kidney.
kidney is not part of digestion, that is the excretory system. So you've got the esophagus, right? You have the gallbladder, the pancreas, right? So all of these part of the digestive system and more. You have the circulatory system, right? And that would include the lungs, the heart, and all the blood vessels, right? So you've got different organ systems, uh, right? Blood vessels are obviously present in the digestive system as well, but right for absorption, let's include that. And so, right, it's not that one organ is perhaps specific to only uh, one system. You can have one organ taking part in more than one system, right? So that is also possible. Okay, what else do we have? And then we have the whole organism. I'll just squeeze it in over here. And so the whole organism is an individual, right, plant or animal formed by all the organ systems working together to produce an independent living thing. Any questions?
No.
All right, so far so good. Now, right after this, even though it in the text it's coming earlier, right? Specialized cells. So we're going to talk about some specialized cells, right? So when in right in a mature organism, right, one that has gone the bulk of its development, so one that has gone through its developmental stage, right? Cells become specialized. So what does that mean? The cells were formed one, right? Each type of cell. So each type of cell performs, right, a particular task. They tend to develop a distinct shape meaning different and recognizable and differentiable. So recognizable and differentiable, so that they can, right, you can differentiable meaning you can differentiate between this cell and that cell, and its shape will help you identify, so recognizable. And special kinds of chemical changes take place in their cytoplasm. right? And so what the specialization helps to do is what is called division of labor, right? So instead of having common cells and perhaps all cells doing everything, which will be a mess. So you've got so many cells and all those cells are doing everything, right? No, I mean, even like when you think about it logically, the efficient way of doing things is by distributing tasks. So you take, okay, fine, group one, right? You do the dusting, and group two, right? You, let's say, change the bed sheets, right? And so that makes it more effective. And so what you're having over here is the specialization. And so, right, the specialized tasks, specialized cells, right, take up specific tasks. And take up, it's not like they choose to do it, right? They're all part of the system. And so that makes it far more efficient. And these cells, right, may or may not go on to form tissues like we talked about. And this division of labor also, right, hints towards the organelles in cells, right? You have the mitochondria producing the energy and the ribosomes synthesizing proteins and etc., right? So that is also an example of division of labor. Now, what are certain examples of specialized cells in animals? So you have red blood cells, right? They are specialized in carrying oxygen. They do not have a nucleus, so they're special in that case. And they have hemoglobin, right? Which is a protein that binds to oxygen and helps it carry it around. Okay, then you have nerve cells, right? And these cells are specialized in conducting electric impulses to and from, meaning towards and away, the brain and spinal cord, right? And the fibers can be very long, right? Maybe going from your brain all the way down to the tip of your toe in your foot. So they can be very long. Then you have your reproductive cells. So you have what are called sperm cells in the males, and right, the reproductive cells are also called the sex cells. And so, right, the ones in the males and the females are different. They have different shapes, structures, and functions. So, right, the sperm has a head where, where the nucleus is present, and the nucleus meaning the genetic material. And it also has a structure called the acrosome, right, which releases an enzyme to break down the layer of cells surrounding the female egg, which we'll just come to. Right? It also has what's called a mid piece that is rich in mitochondria, and we know what mitochondria do. They provide energy, although we haven't gone into detail about that, but it's come up a few times, right? And it also has a tail for movement, and the textbook has an image of this guy. Then you've got the egg cell, right, or the ovum. So I can put a slash over there, and that is the female reproductive cell or the female sex cell. They are vastly larger than the sperm. In fact, the human female egg cell is so large, it is the only cell that is visible with the naked eye. It can be seen without a microscope. It is the only cell of the human body that can be seen without a microscope. It's that big, right? And they have this, so they are spherical in size, sorry, shape, and they have a large amount of cytoplasm, right? And droplets of, now, of fat and protein, and obviously they also carry genetic information. Then some of the specialized cells. Oh, one more. You have ciliated cells.
Axel also has mitochondria.
Huh?
Mitochondria is also present in axil.
Yes, but it's not a highlight because it's one of, like, it also has other organelles, right? So the reason why the mitochondria was highlighted in the sperm is because they've got this region called the midpiece, which is very rich in mitochondria, right? And because the egg cell is not moving, it's not actively moving. The sperm actually has a tail that moves like a rotor, right? And
Yeah.
and makes it go forward. So that requires a lot of energy. So there's much more mitochondria in the sperm cell. That's why it was specifically mentioned,
Oh,
right? Ciliated cells, right? So these guys are present in the nose and the windpipe, and they have, right, tiny hair-like structures, called cilia. So ciliated cells meaning cells that have cilia, and these guys move right in a flicking action. So it's like, right, they go oops and then whoop, and then it's like I'm just showing the direction of movement. It's not like they're getting up and changing place. So they move right uh, in a certain direction, and with that, what they do is that they carry mucus in the airways away from the lungs, right? And this mucus contains perhaps dust or bacteria or something which you don't want coming into your body, right? So it's a protective mechanism. Now, talking about specialized cells in plants, you have the root hair cell, right? And these cells are specialized to for absorbing water, minerals, and nutrients, right, from the soil. And right, they have thin hair-like projections that penetrate. So they make their way between soil particles, right? And what that does is that gives a large surface area for absorption and absorption. And they also, right, their cell membranes. So this is important. Their cell membranes can control, uh, which substances enter the cell. Although technically that's true for all cells, just like the mitochondria mentioned for right earlier. And then you've got the palisade mesophyll cells. And in a leaf, they're found in the leaf, right, beneath or below the epidermis, the upper epidermis, in fact. And they are like columns. They're shaped like vertical columns. Well, columns are vertical, right? And they are packed. So that means have a lot with chloroplasts, right? And that chloroplast traps energy, provide, and carries out photosynthesis. Any questions?
No.
Okay. Then Right, in the book, they have the topic of microscopy, which we've already covered earlier, right, last class.
Yes.
So obviously, I won't be going over that again. And then at the end, they also give you a guide to the size of different objects and converting them. And they suggest that it's better to convert the sizes to the smaller units like micrometers or millimeters, depending on what it is that you're studying. Okay, and that brings us to the end of the chapter. Now, if you're with me, I can begin the next chapter. Do you want to carry on?
Yeah.
Okay, so new page for that. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to skip chapter 2, classification. We'll come back to that later because it seems like an oddball over here,
Yeah.
right? We're talking about animals and plants and the structure and everything, and certainly classification comes in. We'll talk about it later when we talk about biodiversity and all of that, right? So near the end of the syllabus, perhaps. So what we're doing now is we're moving on to chapter 3.
But the second chapter is more interesting.
Uh, well, personally, I'm not a fan of ecology. I never did like it in O level or A level or in university, but it is there and I can and I will teach it, right? So it's a good thing you find it interesting, right? If you have that inclination, I will come back to it later.
Yeah.
So, movement into and out of cells. And so, in this chapter, we will talk about right how different substances how are different substances transported right again into and out of cells, and we will talk about diffusion, osmosis, and active transport. Just give me a sec. Yeah. Okay. So let's start with what are we starting with? We're starting with diffusion. Or in fact, we start with why do we need this? So, right, we are multicellular organisms, as we just saw, and we are very large, right? And so we need mechanisms or processes, in this case, mechanisms to provide right food and energy to all the cells of the body. Right now, in a single celled organism or in smaller organisms that are perhaps multicellular but very small, so in single celled like bacteria, right, or small multicellular organisms, right, what they have is a large surface area to easily absorb right nutrients, water, oxygen directly from their environment. Uh, environment. right? But as multicellular organisms, even if assuming we can put our hand on the food and the food is absorbed into our hand, how will it reach our stomach? How will it reach our brain? We've got bones, right? And we are very large. So unless, even if you are, for example, taking a swim in a sea of, I don't know, Nihari, perhaps, which does not sound very pleasant and probably won't be, right? Still, you will not be able to absorb all the food and get it everywhere, right? And plus, food needs to be broken down, etc., etc. And so, right, digestion and everything will come into play. We'll talk about all of that obviously much later. But right now, we'll focus on the different mechanisms that are involved. So, starting off with diffusion. And what is diffusion? So, it is the net movement of particles, obviously of some substance, from a region of their higher concentration to a region of their lower concentration, right, which is called moving down a concentration gradient, right? And this happens as a result of random movement. Now let's talk about this. Okay, diffusion is not something that happens only in living organisms, right? So, for example, right, you are in a room, right? There is a smell in a room, and after some time, you can detect that smell outside the room, right? The question is, well, how did that happen?
because of diffusion.
Yes, it's because the particles of whatever that smell was of, let's say it was a perfume, right? And particles of the perfume have energy and they're moving, right? And also, right, you've got particles of air, they also have energy and they're also moving, right? So not only are these particles moving, they're right, they're also crashing into the air particles. And so because of that, right, so because of the energy of the particles and because of their collision with, in this case, because we're talking about a gas in the air with air molecules, they spread. And that spreading is called diffusion. Right now, the example I've given is a gas in air, right? You can have one liquid diffusing into another, so you've got two liquids. For example, you've got a drop of color in water. You can have a liquid and gas. For example, right, mixing, for example, oxygen in water. Why would we want to mix oxygen in water? Or, right, or for example, mixing carbon dioxide in water. So let's do CO2 instead of water. So, for example, you got a fish tank with plants, which I do. And so we know plants need carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, and so you are pumping carbon dioxide into the water so that the plants can absorb that and carry out photosynthesis. And so the gas molecules will dissolve in the water. The concept is the same. Over here, the molecules of two liquids will they have energy. They're moving on their own. They're bumping into each other, so they're spreading. Over here, the gas molecules have energy. So do the liquid molecules, and they're moving on their own. They're also bumping into each other, and so right. And this case, right? Well, in both these cases, right, the diffusion results in dissolving. You can also perhaps have a solid and liquid. For example, you have got sugar in water. Now, the thing about diffusion is that it is most effective in gases, right? Less in liquids, and doesn't really work in solids themselves, right? So the example I gave was a solid and liquid, not two solids. Two solids will not diffuse into each other. They won't do anything. And it is most effective in short distances, right? Especially in living systems. So for this to happen, right, depending on a number of factors, right, it will take a long time. And for example, the drop of color mixing in water, this one, it might take a whole day or more. That is, if you leave it and let it work on its own. You're not shaking or giving any sort of vibrations or stirring it or mixing it. None of that. Okay. So if you leave it, it normally takes a long time. And so we will study how in biological systems diffusion is made to be an efficient process, right? So things that diffuse, for example, into and out of cells, oxygen going in, carbon dioxide coming out, water, nutrients, right, and all sorts of other things. Now, since right, it is full time for class, we will continue this tomorrow. Carry on with an explanation of diffusion, then osmosis, and then active transport. I don't think we'll be able to cover the entire chapter tomorrow, but we will cover as much as we can. Any questions?
No.
All clear? All good?
Yeah.
Okay, then I'll see you next time. In fact, yeah, tomorrow. Okay. All right.
Left.
Allah.